fascinating graphic released by Pew Research, Pat, looking at the COVID deaths in red and blue districts. So for some reason, this is a thing we're doing now where we're just breaking this along political lines to try to prove points, I guess, on politics. I don't even understand what the point of something like this would be. Yeah. But I guess the idea from their perspective is, look, let's illustrate the fact that there's been a big decrease in Democratic districts and there hasn't been a big decrease in Republican districts. That's the attempt here. It says, since mid-April, COVID-19 deaths have declined in Democratic districts, but have been relatively stable in Republican districts. And they have a helpful graph to illustrate what has happened. Now, anyone who would think about this for a moment would say, well, the worst stuff happened in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And yes, they've had a big decrease, but from a terrible peak, right? Uh-huh. So you would say, okay, a lot of Democratic districts there, it would make sense they were decreasing. Where in a state like Texas that never had a huge flare-up, it wouldn't make sense for them to decrease. Decrease from what, right? Like they have...
It was already low.
It was already low. That would be your just right off the top of your head impression of someone who said that, right?
Yes.
Well, shockingly enough, that is exactly what the graph shows. And the graph actually illustrates that the Republican peak in deaths was 2 per, I believe it's, let's see, average.
2 per 100,000?
Yeah, I was trying to think if I think is it 2 per million or 2 per 100,000? 2 per 100,000, I don't know. The graph is not labeled exactly correctly. But point being, whatever ratio they're using here, 2 for the Republicans was the peak. And it is decreased slightly to 1.7, okay? On the Democratic side, it peaked at 7.4. So that is almost 4 times as many as it ever was in a Republican district. And it has decreased, largely because of that Northeast area, down to 4.1.
But still more than twice as high.
As the peak, more than twice as high as the peak. Which situation would you rather have? Would you rather have the Republican situation where you peak at 2 and fall to 1.7? Or would you rather have the Democratic situation where you peak at 7.4 and decrease to 4.1? Now, that is it's obvious when you look at the graph. You'd much rather have the Republican situation, and the deaths have been much, much lower. How do you title that graph? The summary being that there's been a decrease in Democratic districts, but stable in Republican. Because the impression you're trying to send...
is amazing.
What are you trying to send there? What's the impression? Republican governors have opened up the states, and they're paying the price.
Right.
Which is obviously not the story of that graph. The story of that graph is Democrats handled this poorly at the beginning, waited too long. We had people like Andrew Cuomo, who I hate to criticize Andrew Cuomo by saying Bill de Blasio was right on something, but Cuomo was out there lighting Bill de Blasio up, saying we are never going to close New York, and then 4 days later closes New York, right?
Right.
They blew this from the beginning in the worst possible way. We talked about the nursing home policy. We talked about, it wasn't until mid-May where they were saying, you know what? Big new policy announcement. We're going to clean the subway cars. Wow. What a brilliant idea there, Andy. Wow. You're right on the cutting edge of fighting this virus. After you already have tens of thousands dead, you think you might clean a subway car. What a good idea. That's a good idea, Andrew. Oh, he is the worst. I'm doing more on the Andrew Cuomo timeline on Stu Does America tonight. Because last time I did it, I think we talked about this on Friday. I started in March, and I was going to do the entire timeline of all of his mistakes. And I could only get through the first 2 weeks of March. So now I need to do the second 2 weeks of March, and we'll go from there. This series could end after the election, I think.
This could take 18 months.
It could.
Is what it could.
It could. Listen to this, though. Very rarely do we hear a news network come out and make one of these accusations like they made against Georgia and Texas and Florida. And when it doesn't go their way, and their way is a bunch of people dying. So think about what their way is for a second. But when it doesn't go their way, they never revisit it, right? They just move on. Like they hit Georgia. They said there's going to be a huge outbreak. Didn't happen. Then they said, okay, well, what about Texas? That didn't happen. What about Florida? That hasn't happened. All these things have gone on over and over again because they find the red state governors. Now, Colorado has a Democratic governor, who opened the state right around the times of these other states and has had no criticism whatsoever. Minnesota is having a much worse time right now with COVID-19 than any of these southern states, and they don't get any criticism either because that's just the way this works. I will give a little bit of credit to NBC News, who actually revisited their Georgia predictions the other night.
Did they?
Yeah, and their tone was they actually said there
amazing.
was no major spike in cases, which is good. And the fact that they did that is something. We have very low expectations of the media at this point. And the fact that they would even acknowledge that they said these things in retrospect is impressive. However, one of the things, if you remember, when Georgia started opening up salons and such, they said a lot of people were critical. If you remember, famously, The Atlantic ran a headline that said Georgia's experiment in human sacrifice. That was their headline. Okay, and that was the tone of the coverage all over the left, including on MSNBC, part of NBC News, who spent day after day after day after day lighting this up. Really heavy criticism. And they do acknowledge the criticism. Listen to the end to hear which criticism they highlight.
Last month, Georgia was one of the first states to reopen, and with the most aggressive approach, allowing barbershops, restaurants, tattoo parlors, and more to welcome customers. The criticism came in droves.
I told the governor very simply that I disagree with his decision, but he has to do what he thinks is right.
Oh, the one piece of criticism they could find of Georgia was President Trump.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's been this guy who's been all over.
Incredible.
Anti-opening the economy up. They couldn't find anything from Rachel Maddow on their own network. They couldn't find anything from Chris Hayes on their own network. They couldn't find anything from NBC News. They couldn't find anything. They couldn't find that Atlantic headline. They couldn't find the dozens and dozens of headlines saying everyone was going to die in Georgia. The only thing they could muster up for criticism was the one time President Trump said, I think you're opening up tattoo parlors and massage parlors a little early. That's the only thing that, when it came to, that was the thrust of all the criticism, if you remember, Pat. And I'm glad they brought that back up. Unbelievable.
Jeez.
It really is pathetic. Just admit it. Like, shouldn't we all be thrilled you were wrong on that? You know, and it's not to say that they will not have a flare-up at some point. They may. But clearly, your impression of what reality was incorrect here. If you had looked at the mobility data, you would realize that almost every state in the union is coming out of lockdown at the same pace, whether the governor says so or not. And that has to do with people realizing, you know what, we can't sit in here forever. We need to go do these things. Let's just be careful. And that's happening all over the country. And so it wouldn't be surprising to you if you understood the data that it's not one of these things where the governor says, okay, the state's open and everyone rushes to the doors. That's not what happens. People aren't doing that. The same thing was true when we went into lockdown. People went into lockdown before the governors said they had to go into lockdown because they were trying to be careful with their own lives. Same thing here. They're trying to be careful with their own economy. They're trying to get out there and be careful and go back to work. And none of this should be surprising to you if you followed this story at any level of depth. You know, if you're just sitting here in this normal back and forth cable news box thing where two boxes are on one side, I think we should open it up. I think we should close it down. If that's your life, well, then you're not going to understand the story at all. When you look at the data, there's no difference between, you know, a state like Georgia as far as coming out and being more mobile and visiting retail stores and all these other things, and tons of other states. There's not really a difference. There are certain areas they've opened up that are different than other states. But generally speaking, there'd be no reason to believe Georgia would have a big outbreak anyway, as opposed to another state. But they don't care about that. That's not their goal. Their goal is to try to trash the president, trash Republicans, teams. It's just unending.